I guess we'll get started now. Welcome to the Stories of Vermilion, the Oral History Series, presented by the Vermilion Area Archival Society in collaboration with the Vermilion History Museum and the River Public Library. I want to mention that our next interview will be with Tom Mose on April 9th. Tom is a river rat. He's sitting right back there if you got any questions. That guy who looks all wet. My name is Rich Tarrant. I'm the curator of the Vermilion History Museum. The program is going to be videotaped, so as Paul has asked you to turn off your cell phones. Our guest tonight is Reverend Glenn Coleman. I've known Glenn for quite a while now. He was the minister of the Evangelical United Church of Christ here in Vermilion for how many years?
From 1968 to 1975.
Have you heard that? Could you hear that?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just making sure that because it's hard for me to hear what's back there. What I'm going to do tonight, starting off, is I'm going to ask you your name, which you've already given, but I'm going to ask it again. Give your name and where you were born.
Oh, my name is Glenn, middle initial E, Coleman, born in central Pennsylvania, a little town of Beaver Springs, Snyder County, about halfway between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and lots of ups and downs in there. But on a farm, 80-acre farm, not large enough for supporting the careers of 3 sons, so some of us had to move on. We all did.
So there are 3 boys in the family. Any girls?
3 boys and 1 girl.
1 girl. Where were you in the line of all of those
I was
children?
the oldest one.
But you opted not to stay on the farm.
All right. I did go to the local high school, which was offering a vocational course. In fact, they were required to offer home ec and agriculture the first 2 years, and everybody had to take it. So, Future Farmer of America and all that type of thing, and sense of organization. And if you need dairy cows evaluated or judged at the state fair, we could do that. So it was fun, and it was a good group. I never was involved much in sports. Our evenings were spent with chores on the farm. We didn't do much else. I did other jobs after school in a hatchery, in a gas station, and walked the 2 miles back and forth to from school to home. Usually got there in time for supper.
How big was the school?
Is what?
How big was the school?
Good question. I probably less than 120. There were 23 people in my class.
Have you ever gone back there?
Yeah, occasionally, and we had that was 1945 that I graduated, so there was a reunion at 35 years, and some at 40, 45, and now the school doesn't exist, and the Alumni Association doesn't either. I guess that's the way it's happened with a lot of them.
They graduated in 1945, is that what you said?
1945.
Right after the war. Or
And
later.
the war was still going on in graduation time, but let's see, I graduated in, I guess in June, May or June, and the war ended in August. I took the test for Air Corps something or other with the Air Force, but once they had the war finished, they didn't need me anymore, and I had other things I was going to do.
Wow. What did you do right after school?
After school,
After you graduated?
after graduation, well, for 1 year, the summertime, I worked for the Pennsylvania Highway Department. I was kind of sad that I used a pick and shovel operator, but it was just a hand tool, and it was an interesting experience. I worked then at a gas station attendant from in 12-hour shifts. That was kind of demanding. But after, and then, let's see, I went to Carlisle to work in the Maslin rug factory for the money, in order to make a little extra money for going to school. I did have, at that time, a project still carry over from my agriculture classes of raising chickens. So with Dad providing the brooder house and the feed, and I took care of the chickens and got the money, whatever came from that. So that was I've always been appreciative of chickens that provided really the first money resource for going on to college expenses. So I respect them.
You probably have a pet chicken now, do you?
Not now.
Where did you go to college?
Lakeland College in Wisconsin. At that time, it was known as Mission House College and Seminary. When I had made this decision about going into the seminary by that time, largely at the encouragement of the local minister, and was something to aim for. Lakeland College is located north of Milwaukee, about 80 miles, and so it was easily accessible by train, and I think I had a $27 ticket to go from Lewistown, Pennsylvania to Sheboygan, Wisconsin for my first trip out there.
Wow. When I talked to you originally several weeks ago, I asked you what was impelled you to get into the ministry, but it wasn't was that your first choice of career? What were you thinking about coming out?
First of all, I was going to be a lawyer. I thought I had heard somewhere in the civic class that lawyers could make $50 a day. So I thought it was good to get into something they can make a little money with. But they had us write a paper, and I think this is moderately significant, of analyzing the things that you would do in a vocation, and in doing the things that what I learned from a lawyer's life in preparing that paper, I decided that it really wasn't as constructive and helpful as I had hoped to be, and so I ended up, and not saying anything against lawyers, that's just my understanding of the way it worked at that time. And I felt that I should be doing something a little more contributing than just making money.
Well, I think you made a good choice.
Thank you.
I'm glad you're not a lawyer. Okay, you got up to Wisconsin to go to school. Did you work while you were going to school? Did I ask you?
Yes, I did. There were times that I worked at the school, maintenance type of thing. I had an agency for dry cleaning. If anybody had some dry cleaning to take to the shop, I'd pick it up through the dormitory and return it to them and collect the money. And I must have made lots of money over that. I don't really know. But I worked at the college. The businesses in Sheboygan, the problem was we were about 18 miles out of town, and how to get into where the businesses were to go to work but when you got a ride, and I ended up working for Sears and Roebuck for a while. I sold overalls, and there was a company called the Block Woodworking Company, and we did lots of dolls and tables and chairs and cabinets. So just interesting experiences. And then I eventually got to be employed by Margie's family in their cheesemaking business. And so I helped lift 80-pound cheddars out of the vat and put into the presses for making cheese. Not too bad a deal.
I just found out about the cheese making business this afternoon.
They were strictly American cheesemakers, and that's a very demanding job too. Margie's folks had, I think her dad worked almost 40 years without a day off, except for when he went to South Dakota for a brother's funeral.
Now, the whole family worked in that cheese factory, correct?
It was a family business.
Family
yeah.
business.
And Margie had two sisters. One was older and one younger, and two brothers who were part of the business, and in fact they continue to be a C.F. Heckman operation.
Wow.
The brothers.
Did you meet Margie before you went to work there or after?
Before, at college. She was a year behind me in school.
Did you get married while you were going to school or after school?
I finished the first year of seminary. Margie was a year behind me. So when she graduated from college with her Bachelor of Science degree in biology and in English, that's when the summer when we got married, 1950.
Did you stay there, or did you take another job after that, or did you still work in?
I continued as a student during the academic year, but I worked for a construction company, building houses, redoing silos, a wide variety of things. I think the silo thing was kind of interesting because I felt at ease doing that. And when I visited people who were in the first church that I served in Pennsylvania were doing high things in their silo, I was able to go up the ladder and greet them up there and do a pastoral call on top of the rigging. They never forgot that.
You got any pictures of that?
Right.
So you had a church in Pennsylvania?
I've had two churches, one charge, two churches, Zion and Bellefonte RD, and Hublersburg was in the village of Hublersburg. Both of them were evangelical and Reformed churches at the time I went there.
Is that the type of church you grew up in, the evangelical Reformed?
Yes. And that was the relationship of the seminary also at the time that I went. But it was in 1957 when the merger with the Congregational Christian Churches formed the United Church of Christ. So that was shortly after I had my first pastorate in the E&R church, but they put the transfer of the pension fund went along with that.
Yeah, I would assume that.
3% of your salary went for the.
So you were in Pennsylvania, but then you went where? Out in the Midwest somewhere, right?
All right, well, while in Pennsylvania, which was a very significant time, I don't know how much you want to talk about that. It doesn't relate to Vermilion that much. But then we had contact with people out in central Iowa, and one church asked me to come out for a trial sermon, and it didn't click. And they had 3 churches that were going to be merging into one, they said. The conference president said that, but the people didn't seem to know about it. So when I talked with the people and learned that, I lost interest in being at that church. But the individual who accompanied me in going to those churches during this Sunday when I preached there, when his church became vacant, he was sure that I was the one who should have to come to their church. I guess after he listened to my sermon 3 times, he thought it would be okay. They were a good family. There were lots of good people there.
Did you stay there for how long?
Well, then we moved to the town of Baxter, and were there 11 years. And it was a good place for some of the next generation to grow up. And Paul, yeah, he had space to run his go-kart and all that stuff. And there was a lot of things that we could do that you can't do in Valley View.
So finally you decided to come back to Ohio, or come to Ohio rather? Or?
Well, since we had grandparents in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, it seemed sensible to find a spot about halfway between. And there were a number of opportunities in Indiana and Illinois and Ohio. I choose to concentrate on the Ohio ones. Here's where there's some connection with people that maybe some are here, but Nelson Parsons and Don Haber, and there were 2 others. It may have been Faith Kishman, and they came out and listened to my sermon in Baxter one Sunday, and we ended up coming back here. That would be in 1968.
Who was the minister here when you came in?
Reverend Greenwald was retiring. Well, not really. He was leaving here and going to another church here in Ohio.
I'm going to read off a few names and see if you remember any of these people from that church. You may not. Mrs. George Harris. Would you know her?
Who?
Mrs. George Harris.
No.
Okay. Millie Harris.
No.
Al Hassenflug.
I knew the name, but they didn't participate.
Yeah. Some of these people are gone, and this is an old list of people. I want to go down here real quick. How about the Hortons? Buell.
They were members, but not
Yeah,
participating.
Yeah, they would come to church now and then.
The people I associate, especially with our arrival, was like Mr. DeWitt.
Yep.
And Willis Gebhardt.
Yep.
And Nelson Parsons. They were people who I guess were on the board at that time.
Ray Maurer.
Ray Maurer, yeah.
Did you like Mr. Gebhardt?
I like Mr. Gebhardt. He didn't put me up against the lockers, and but as he did some, I guess, emphasize his points. I felt quite a bit at ease with the people on the farms around Vermilion.
Okay, like Mr.
The
Trimmer.
Wills and Risdens, Trinners. They were, I guess I was maybe more acquainted with them than with the factory type people. But it was an interesting blend of vocations and lifestyles that was different from anything I had experienced before.
Did you go out to any of their farms, like Risden's or Trinner?
I didn't understand.
Did you go out to their farms, to their homes?
I think probably one of my strengths was visiting in the homes and activities, and I traveled around. I think I mentioned in that one paper that I never made I didn't make a call ahead of time and say, I'm coming to visit you today, you're gonna be home. I just went, and I found the people at home that were there, and we'd visit. If there wasn't anybody home, I'd go to the next place, and I really probably knocked myself out doing home calls to people.
Didn't go to work there, did you?
Did what?
Didn't go to work in the farms, did you?
I did help make hay once, I think, yeah. But there was a lot of hospital calling. Apparently in those days, people stayed in the hospital a lot longer than they do now. And it was pretty regular, a couple times a week, going to St. Joseph's or Lorraine Community. And I was always glad for the opportunity to see people in that condition and help them where I could and encourage them.
A lot of fun. Did you ever know Sam Edge? Do you remember him?
What?
Sam Edge, do you remember him?
No.
I know you know Amos Feisley.
Amos Feisley, Amos, Doris.
And Doris, yes, they're very active. Along with Mrs. Mauer, Evelyn.
Evelyn, right.
She was probably there quite often.
Kneisels.
Kneisels, Ivor Ford.
The Fords. Kathy.
The Haverds, of course. I'm trying to look over these things. Here's one that I want to talk about a little bit. Do you remember a lady named Sophie? Sophie Stevens? She was a very old woman.
Sophie Stevens. No. Okay. I made calls on her often,
I'm sure.
but why didn't, it seems to me her name was, did she have a double name?
Well, I don't know about that, but
She was connected with the Rices and
yeah, the Reese. Yeah, sure. It even says that.
Reese.
Reese. And you knew Hattie Reese.
She was with the Pythian sisters in Medina.
Yeah, you probably can't see this, but it's her obituary that I pulled out of the paper. Sophie Stevens. She was 100 years old when she passed away. Glenn did do her funeral, but the reason I brought her up is Sophie was a town character. It was before you got here. But the reason I bring her up is that Sophie used to wear a great big overcoat, a great coat, and she liked to go to the movies. Well, before she went to the movies, she'd go down to like Okagi's or the White Inn, wherever, and she'd get her dinner. And she'd put it under her coat and go to the movies, and she'd sit there and watch the movies and have dinner. She was quite a character.
I always thought of Hattie Reese as an interesting person, and somehow was she connected, related to her?
Sophie, it could have been a distant relation. Stevens were people who lived out in the Joppa Road area. And her husband came into town. I think he may have worked for the city. That's something when he was, but he would have been gone by the time that you got here. I think he would have been dead, given the fact that she lived to be 100. You know.
I think she had two husbands. One of them was
under the coat.
a very wealthy traveled person, and She described having gone to different parts of the country and traveled around a lot.
Hattie, you know, Hattie was a talent. She did the chalk.
I was always kind of partial to Hattie. She encouraged me. She said I should publish a book of prayers. She liked the way I prayed, I guess. I always thought that was pretty generous of her. Of course, was she related to Zenobia?
Yes. All of those people were related. Hattie, Zenobia would have been Zenobia Whitmore, I believe. Hattie was also a Whitmore. Hattie's dad, well, it was actually her uncle started the Vermilion News, the newspaper, and then her dad, George, bought the newspaper. At one point in time, Hattie was listed as the publisher.
Oh.
But Hattie was a real talent. She could sing, she could draw, paint,
Right.
and she was a little lady.
Right. Zenobia was about the same size.
And Zenobia was a musician.
She was great on the piano and on the organ, and she had her own little domain in the music department of the church.
Oh, for sure.
Zenobia did.
Oh, sure, for sure.
Yeah.
Zenobia was Zenobia Crop. And if you know the Crop ladies especially, they were kind of, they would dominate things. They're nice, don't get me wrong, they're nice people, but they would take over and dominate. Like Zenobia, her thing was music.
Yeah.
And that was her place. And that's what she did. I talked before, when I was talking to you, I mentioned George Lavin and his wife,
Eleanor.
Lavin, and I'm trying to remember, there was one other person. Mrs. Fazy.
Doris.
Yeah, they sang together, these women. I don't know if you ever heard them sing
I don't
together.
think I ever heard that.
Yeah, somewhere I have a photograph of the three, Hattie, Zenobia, or not Hattie, Mrs. Fazy, and Mrs. Lavin singing together, but they were going around to different churches singing. When you first got to Vermilion, what kind of transportation did you have? Did you have your own car? I assume you did, probably.
Yeah, always did.
Did you have a house, or did you buy one when you got here? How did that work?
Reverend Greenwald lived in a parsonage on the west side of the church, and our choice was to have our own house and have a house allowance, and that was a new venture for the church, but they did very well backed us up. It took a while for the bankers to be willing to take on this loan because they didn't think a person earned enough money to support the payments for a house. Maybe you know about that, Bill. Anyway, Don Haber was a big help in getting us lined up, and I cashed life insurance policies for a down payment, and we got a house in Valley View, and Oakview Drive, the one where I still live.
It's the same house?
Same house.
Wow.
When I did leave here, we went to live in Sandusky. We rented a house to Carol Harrison for 15 years. And then when I retired in Sandusky, we had this house to live in, come back, and I was somewhat reluctant about that. I wasn't really that enthused about it, but I guess you have to live someplace, so I'm glad we had the house then.
Well, we missed you.
Missed out.
Which church did you go to in Sandusky? I'll come back to Vermilion in a minute.
First Reformed, Evangelical Reformed, United Church of Christ, now First Faith. They left the denomination, as the Evangelical Reformed Church here did also. The UCC had trouble hanging on to some of its more faithful people.
Yeah, I realize that, but I don't really want to get into any of that right now. Going back to the church here in Vermilion, when you didn't take the parsonage that they had on the west side, that big house that was back
That's right,
there.
that was taken down, and that's now a parking lot.
Correct. Had they built an addition on when you were here?
No, that was here when I came.
It was here already. Were
Right.
any of the houses on Grand Street next to the church still there?
Yes, they were.
There was 3 of them.
And they went down all the time I was here. And we did the remodeling of the inside of the building, took out the inner wall and incorporated the Christian Education Department and the sanctuary into one.
Yeah, I wasn't real familiar with the upper part of the church at those during that time, but I remember there was 2 sets of stairs on the front at one time. The ones that exist now and then to the north, there was another set at one time.
Right, they were
But that was all incorporated into the.
removed, I don't know when.
Pete Needing lived in that big house there behind the church for a while. You know Pete? Russ's son.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And Russ worked for the
Of
church.
course, I should have mentioned Russell right away because he was the world's best church custodian.
I remember Russ always working around there.
Yeah,
They didn't have a big yard to mow, but he mowed it and he kept the place looking pretty
he
nice.
sure did.
Russ was a nice fellow.
And I didn't really mention about Mrs. Lavin, who had served as secretary for the years when, most of the time when I was there, Eleanor and George. I don't know just where they lived here in the north.
They lived Volunteer Bay.
But they they were very faithful and occupied kind of a standard place in the church.
Who can you think of off the top of your head some people who really influenced you while you were in town here?
Would you repeat that?
Some people who may have influenced you positively while you were in town, while you were living here and working as the minister here.
Well, I remember Louis Rao at the bank, who was mayor, I believe, at the time. The Swensons were a good, solid family, and we appreciated them in several ways.
Did
I
you?
wasn't really that acquainted with people on Main Street.
Well, I know some of the people you were acquainted with. One of them was Jim Hart.
Oh, yes, of course. He was an employer for 2 of our kids, and
Yeah, which ones?
Kathy and Bruce.
And where's Bruce now?
Bruce is living in Stowe, working for Unisys as a consultant, but he's doing it out of his home. So he has an 8 to 5 job of sitting by his computer, and I don't envy him that at all.
And your daughter, you did tell me something.
And Kathy is now living in on Whidbey Island out in north of Seattle. Recently moved there. They weren't exactly retired, but they didn't have a job. So I guess they were retired out there.
So I was going to ask you what they do, but I guess you answered that question. Do you remember any of the stores around town when you first came here?
The one I think of that first comes to mind was the Lawson store out on the west side. Because I always liked to buy the ice cream from them.
You know where the police station is? Is that where the police station is?
Yes, I think it's one.
Yeah.
And of course, the Kyle's Kyle Motors, they took care of repairs and servicing of my vehicles and sold us a couple good deals. They sold us that little blue Opal. Maybe you remember seeing it running around town.
That's it. Cops were chasing?
It was. I think there were a lot of miles spent on that little car.
Great. Okay, you mentioned Jim Hart, you mentioned Louis Rao. Any of these other stores here in town? Did you go into any of the restaurants in town? Marjorie's probably a good cook.
Too good a cook, and we didn't go out to restaurants very much, but Okagi's or the man from Japan,
Yeah, it was Okaya.
Okagi, we knew him. He lived on Oakview Drive also in Valley View. So, but we were not very much of a customer. Occasionally to the Prague. Paul was a dishwasher at the Prague restaurant for a while.
Do you get those dishes clean?
Yeah, keep it clean.
But staying along with what we're talking about Louis Rao, do you remember any of the other mayors here in Vermilion?
No, not really.
Okay. Do you remember Nelson Parsons?
Oh, yes. Yeah. And all the Parsons family, and they are still continuing the Parsons traditions in good ways too. I was thinking now of Vert Lighthizer, who I remember he was in his 80s, and I thought he was such an old person. But he had, he was one of the first people I knew that had a pacemaker, and they had to be repaired, and they gave him another one, and then that one stopped working. He kept going on just the same as before, always. The pacemaker quit working, but he was ready to go to a street dance or whatever would come up.
Sure.
Yeah, that was Vern. That's Mr. Energy. And recently there's been a celebration of Dawn Full. And of course, Ray was a person I got to know pretty well, or of him. And he was always had some pointed views about the community and the things that had been and that he knew about. So I was kind of liked Ray, but I didn't really know that much about his business other than the fishery that he had.
He was a member of your church, correct?
He was a member of the church,
Correct.
and mostly. But I think Dawn was not.
Probably not. But, well, do you have any hobbies?
Yeah. My hobby was always my work, I guess, and my family. I liked astronomy. We had a telescope and do some searching of the skies, and had the right kind of a hammer for going around checking rocks and doing some rock hounding.
Wow.
But in general, I don't think of myself as a hobbyist.
Write a lot
Reading a lot.
Read, and do you do some writing too as well?
One of the things I had, which I think was kind of unique here in Vermilion, was what I called the good word, and maybe somebody is acquainted with it, I don't know. There was a number published in the paper of that people could call for a 5-minute message, and I used to concentrated on that quite a bit, and I changed it every week. I have no idea how many people actually accessed it. I don't, maybe nobody.
I did. I remember.
You got a tinker back there.
Oh, good. But I was hoping that, I still have a stack of those, copies of those that I read off. And I always thought when I would be no longer gone, my family could publish those things and make lots of money out of the documents.
He's waiting. He's waiting.
Well, you can tell they're probably really only good for starting a fire when you on a grill.
That's what Hattie was talking about, though, wasn't it?
I think so. No.
No? She was talking about your sermon?
She was talking about the pastoral prayers in church.
You probably still have all those, too?
No, I have some probably. I think they'd all be pretty much the same.
Do you do any writing other than that now?
I do a lot of emails now. I don't do much than anything in paper. My writing is so terrible, I can hardly read it myself.
Who do you email?
What?
Who do you email?
Family, a reducing circle of friends around the country because they aren't responding.
Email was a lot better than trying to write letters to everybody.
It's true. I save a lot of postage that way.
What is your favorite thing to do, Rain? Just read now? A lot of reading? What kind of things do you read?
I've had a variety of shelves, a couple thousand books, not like Reverend Bertoni, but I have more than my share of books, and I said, I'm going to read those when I retire. And they're still collecting dust, mostly.
Louis would probably read them for you.
Yeah, turn them over to him.
You told me at one point in time you took a trip for the UCC. You went overseas for something?
I had that opportunity back in when I was pastor in Pennsylvania to participate in the Heifer International program, and that was through the Connecticut Conference and the Central Pennsylvania Conference. We took a boatload of heifers to Europe in 1956. That's getting back there quite a ways too. And I often wonder what is happening with the progeny of those 65 heifers and what they produce. But that was my fling at going to Europe on a very much of a shoestring and doing what I thought was some good, meeting a lot of interesting people, and got behind the Iron Curtain a little bit and visited in Berlin, some of the major spots in Europe. I even was blessed by the Pope, the person who became the Pope. He was coming out of St. Mark's Cathedral into the square, and he gave a blessing while I'm standing there. So
Did it work?
so far, pretty good, yeah.
Well, right
But
now,
that was very good. I felt that my contribution to Heifer Project was significant in terms of my memory, but also in doing some good to meet refugee people, people in difficult circumstances, and people in high places. Maybe I should skip this, but one of the people that I met in Berlin was named Jürgen Winterhager, who was an assistant to Bishop DeBalius, who was one of the presidents of the World Council of Churches. And Winterhager had been arrested by the Russian authorities, who came and quizzed him about the threat of the World Council of Churches to world communism at that time. And he described in rather gruesome ways the torture that he experienced, and kind of makes me shiver to think about it yet, that they actually did pull out fingernails and didn't treat a person very nice. But he had a conclusion for this, and I think this is important, that he said the torture that they did for him, he was surprised at how his body strengthened his faith. First of all, his faith strengthened his body, he could stand it. But later on, he realized that his body was strong enough to help him rebuild his faith, that he really believed what he was participating in and could resist them. And I've always thought about that. That was really a gruesome thing, but a significant witness that he had in regard to what his faith in God grew into him and allowed him to be. And I'm sure he wrote a book called Day is Dawning, and out of the thousands of books that we have stored away somewhere, I keep looking for that, and maybe I'll find it sometime and read it.
You haven't found it yet?
No.
Okay.
I'm sure it's probably in the library and available that way.
Okay, what I'm going to do now is turn this over and see if anybody has questions that they might want to ask you out there.
Ask them to speak loudly so I hear.
They've got a microphone there, so they can.
They've been very patient, very quiet.
You guys hear me okay?
What?
You hear and tell me what it is.
Okay, somebody asked a question.
Well, now that there's a microphone, everybody's staring.
That's it. Margaret, you got any questions? Here comes Hattie's got a question.
Is this good?
What?
Can people hear me okay if I speak like this? So if you came in the 1950s to town and you had a connection with the rural community, you must have seen how the town changed when the Ford factory grew and was established. Can you talk a little bit about changes you might have seen in the town?
I guess I'm not a very good observer of that. I was thinking more of the residents than the businesses, but obviously the town has moved from through several cycles in this period of time of 50 years, as everybody here well knows, the calm pastoral background and the rather lively industrial spirit and the loss of that. And I think there's the expectation about trying to get back to the time when there's going to be more of that liveliness and expectation, and it's there. I'm sure that's going to happen. It's pretty obvious that things do cycle, and in general I think the people have the ability and the resources to kind of roll with it, and there's more good in a few of the people than there is in something to worry about, I think, something to work at. So I don't know if that's my point of view, Patty. I'm thinking of, I believe the town had just reached the point of being a city about that time, that they were a smaller group getting large enough to be classed as a city, and after incorporating VOL with the city, it's become more citified, maybe a little less countrified, but still very genuine. And this is part of the obvious, the fisheries as an illustration that at that time people were still catching fish, and they were going out, and it was expected that they'd be coming back with a good load and fish to market. And that, of course, faded out altogether now. I'm no expert on the economics, but I think that there's room for getting back to some of that understanding. We had Captain Inches that was at the museum. Maybe some of you remember the captain. I know once in talking with him, he said that he lived in the west of town, near Sheriff Park and all that. I said, oh, at the trailer park. He said, oh, no, those are mobile homes. They aren't trailers. They pointed that out to me pretty quickly. But there's this stability that is represented, I think, in what he said, that it's not just a movement that happens once, but it's a continual turnover of good things that are being built and happening for the town. I've nothing but respect for people like those the ship captains. I think of Mr. Bauman. There were other, even Captain Horton was alive when I was here, and I got to know him. And so there were many good people who were a strong influence and gave the town stability, and I think that stability can still be found.
Was Parsons still fishing when you came here?
Yes, they were.
Parsons, and that's what Ray Full was involved in the Cushman, so. Yeah, you're right. Did you know, oh, darn it. Can't think of his name.
I was thinking with Patty's family, it seems to me, oh, there you are. Your father-in-law, Bill, was in World War II. It seems to me that he was a Jeep driver for Patton.
Or a general.
General Patton.
I don't know if it was General Patton, but it was
But I
someone
thought
famous.
about that just the other day when I looked at the display upstairs, talking about Mr. Ritter and his connection with the Jeep automobile and vehicle, and that here Bill Cushman was driving one of those for the generals around in Europe in World War II. Thought it was an interesting connection.
Chester Jackson is the one I was thinking of.
Excuse me?
Did you know Chester Jackson
Yes, I knew Chester.
and his wife?
He was not the most talkative. I couldn't get a whole lot out of him different times, but he had a nice house over there at the edge of town. He was, of course, the strong fisherman. Mr. Schlesselman
Yeah, Ollie.
was in business with him at the time.
Chester, Ollie, Chester's wife was a crop. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of these people. Paul lives in their house, this guy over here.
Nice place.
Any more questions?
Well, I would have asked a follow-up question. Did you, without giving away any personal secrets or anything, did you find that as a pastor, the problems that people faced changed in the time that you were a minister?
In Vermilion or
Just in your personal
since
experience.
1952. I was ordained in 1952. Probably not. The economics, the attitudes, they have maybe been more publicized, but they were just as real way back in the simpler times than they are now. So I don't say that I can spot big changes. I think people are a little more vocal and willing to work at them or even make an issue of some of their problems if they have them. And I believe that that's a good thing.
Peter?
Well, Will Pretzer was a,
The Pretzer family?
yeah, the Pretzers. And wasn't his dad or grandfather a pastor at the ENR?
Had been
Yeah.
maybe an uncle
Oh, okay.
who were the Pretzers who lived at Heidelberg Beach.
Right.
And it was their uncle who had been the minister here at, I don't know what time, I'd have to check that.
It was 1890
Sure.
and 1901. Albert Pretzer.
Are they still, is Willard still living?
No, he passed, it was more, 4 or 5 years ago
I
or
see.
something. Yeah.
Well, they were good, solid citizens of the community and contributed a lot. You didn't see much of them during the summertime. And they were enjoying Heidelberg Beach.
Pretzer came back. He was earlier a minister, but he came back in 1909. He was here for another 10 years as minister.
He'd be, I'm sure, very influential in the
Well,
attitudes of the people.
He was in Vermilion because the previous minister got into an argument with a businessman here in Vermilion. He didn't think they were progressive enough,
Oh.
so he got mad and left. So Pretzer came back and stayed for 10 years.
Yeah.
I think Willard Pretzer, I think he was a POW in Europe. He flew a fighter plane and got shot down, I think. Do you remember that? Or was he a POW in Europe?
I didn't understand.
Oh.
Should use a mic.
Oh, okay. Well, I think Mr. Pretzer, Willard Pretzer, had been shot down in Europe during World War II. I think he was a fighter pilot.
Oh, Will.
Do you remember that? Did he mention that? Or?
He never wanted to talk about it, but he did
Yeah.
later on that he was a prisoner of war in Germany, and I guess he was treated pretty well because he had some command of the language. He didn't. That was part of his story.
I think and Louis, did Mr. Pretzer with ENR services in German? Yeah. The ENR services were in German years ago when the Pretzers, Albert Pretzer had the.
Did you speak German?
No, a little Pennsylvania Dutch. but
There you go.
Not enough to say that I could communicate in it.
There's another lady here. Step up to the microphone.
Hi, I'm a transplanter. My family and I are a transplant to Vermilion. You were here from 1968 to 75, is that
Yeah.
correct? Was there anything during that time period outside historically that you remember the town reacting to? I believe the Vietnam War was going on. Do you remember anything outside that affected your church historically during that time period?
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding.
Uh, Vietnam, did you lose anyone in your church to somebody in the war, or was there a historical figure that came during that time to the town that that kind of, was there ever an outside historical event that was happening on the world stage that affected your church or something in your church?
I don't think that I can pinpoint any particular incident or event, but I know that there were attitudes not liking the participation of what was going on. But I can't pinpoint any particular event that would indicate that.
I was curious as a church how you reacted to anything going on outside, and I don't know if I'm making this clear, probably not. We hear every day, things are coming at us every day, and I was just curious, during that time, did you come together as a church to pray for the Vietnam War? Were there people coming back from Vietnam? Were there other things going on?
Not that I can pinpoint.
Okay, all right, thank you.
There wasn't as much turmoil going on back then, as at least in Vermilion, as you would think. You know,
I think it just sort of hits you every day, so I was kind of curious how a church reacted or how a town reacted, because it was right after Kennedy was shot, and so I was just kind of curious how a small town reacted to outside things happening.
basically life went on.
Yeah.
I mean, there would have been pockets of people that did this, that, and the other thing, but it wasn't, the town as a whole didn't jump up and march up and down the road or anything.
Were there many trans people, you had a lot of sort of people that had been here for a long time historically. Were there quite a few transplants that were coming to Vermilion during that time period because of the Ford plant,
Yep.
because of all the jobs, you know, from what I've heard is like Kentucky and West Virginia and
New York.
all New York, all of these
Massachusetts.
people were, I was just curious if that was a time where you saw a lot more transplants than historically the people that were here for generations.
From about 1950, there was about 2,000 people in Vermilion. When Ford came in around the late 50s, the town exploded, and that's basically when it became a city. So you went from 2,000 people to 10,000 or more people. So it was a big change. I don't know how many, did you have a lot of Ford workers in your church?
I wouldn't say a lot.
So, you know, it was different. Actually, in our church where you were, there was a lot more history there, I think, as far as the people. You know, they went deeper into the historical past of the town. They weren't transplants, a lot of the people that you had there. At least I don't think. You were there.
There were a few. There were some who came just for working at Ford.
A lot of those people who came into town brought their religion with them. They brought their churches with them, more or less. You see the creation of the Baptist churches and stuff like that at the time. But you know all that. Any more questions? Well, if not, I want to thank Reverend Coleman. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.